In the following mock negotiation, you will hear variations of the phrase prejudiced in the extreme. This phrase is a euphemism made famous by a Delaware vice chancellor in footnote 2 of the decision in Vintage Rodeo Acquisition versus Rent-A-Center. Essentially, prejudiced in the extreme means here are the relevant excerpts from the Rent-A-Center opinion.
Let's turn now to our fake negotiation segment. Keith and I are going to negotiate one of the more controversial catch-all representations in the acquisition agreement for a private company acquisition, and that's the so-called full disclosure representation and its companion rep, the so-called 10b-5 rep. As usual, Keith will be playing the role of the outside lawyer representing the large cap publicly traded buyer, and I will be playing the role of the outside lawyer representing the privately held venture-backed target company. Now, your draft reps were predictably overly expansive, exceedingly wide-ranging. There were 28 of them in total. They addressed everything, even things I couldn't think of. They addressed the company's capitalization, contracts, litigation, legal compliance, employees, labor relations, benefits, everything under the sun. On top of these 28 reps, you're asking for this additional catch-all representation, the 29th rep, or as I call it, the last straw. If you look at it, it has two parts. You've labeled the first part a full disclosure representation, and let me just read it quickly. It says, except for facts set forth in the disclosure schedule and except for facts relating to general economic or industry conditions, there is no fact relating specifically to target that individually or considered together with other facts could reasonably be expected to adversely affect the assets, business, prospects, financial condition, or results of operations of target in any material respect. First, why do you need this representation when you have 28 other representations?
Well, Rick, it's pretty obvious. We might have missed something.
Basically, this is a flat rep that my client has disclosed everything material. Honestly, have you ever gotten a rep like this from anyone with a law school education and a brain? I mean, seriously, ever. I want to know. I want you to show it to me. Or are you just trying to do your best, as you often do, to prejudice me in the extreme and see if I'll notice? Because I think this is outrageous. We've just got to put a big fat X through this thing.
I see you're a little worked up.
I'm a little upset. As you can tell, I'm getting a little emotional here.
I'll concede that this was probably put in by an overeager associate. May not have a job next week. I will talk to the associate, and I'll agree. We'll either get rid of this Clause A, or maybe we'll just knowledge qualify it.
Well, guess what? I'm going to go with get rid of it. Okay, one down, one to go. Now let's take a look at the second sentence, Part B. You label this a 10b-5 rep. First of all, why do you call this a 10b-5 rep?
This is sort of modeled after SEC Rule 10b-5.
I see that, Keith, and I appreciate it. So let me read the rep. It says, neither this agreement nor the disclosure schedule contains any representation or other statement that omits to state a material fact necessary to make the representations or other statements therein in light of the circumstances in which they were made not misleading. If I'm reading this correctly, it basically says my client has disclosed everything material. It's ridiculously overbroad, and for the same reason we got rid of the first one, we're now going to put a big X through this one.
Now you're going a bit too far. So if you look at this, it's very different than the first one. The first one doesn't relate back to the agreement. It does not relate back to the reps in the agreement. This one does. It says necessary to make the reps or other statements made in the agreement materially misleading. So this is very different. A naked failure to say something material is not covered by this. It's got to be something that makes the reps materially misleading.
I'll give you that. The rep is not quite as broad as the ridiculous full disclosure rep, but I still think it's broad, and too broad for me to be comfortable with.
But wait a second. Isn't your client covered by SEC Rule 10b-5 anyway?
What do you mean?
The proposed transaction is a purchase by my client of shares of stock of your client. It's a sale of securities to my client, right?
Well, no. This transaction is not a sale of securities. This transaction is a sale of an entire business.
Yeah.
Keith, that's what you're selling. This is an M&A deal. This is not a securities issuance or anything like that.
Obviously, you missed this class in law school. The way my client is buying the business is it's buying securities. And there was a case called Landreth Timber that was talked about in the time that you were out golfing.
I wasn't golfing, I was sleeping.
And that was decided about 50 years ago, about half of your age. A sale of the business structured as a sale of shares is covered by the U.S. securities laws. So your client is subject to Rule 10b-5 in the context of a sale of shares.
Okay, but SEC Rule 10b-5 provides buyers with a fairly limited private remedy. To prove an SEC Rule 10b-5 violation, a buyer has to overcome all kinds of hurdles. The buyer has to prove, among other things, reliance, causation, materiality, and perhaps most important, scienter, tough Latin word. Roughly translated, it means intent to deceive. And to prove a breach of a flat contractual rep, like the 10b-5 rep you're asking me to agree to here, no scienter need be proved. So you tried to trick me, and I'm not going to fall for this trick. Frankly, I think it's almost misleading to even call this a 10b-5 representation, because the remedies for breaching this rep are much broader than the remedies for violating SEC Rule 10b-5s.
All right, you got me.
This rep might be appropriate in a securities offering where there are passive investors with absolutely no negotiating leverage, but here your client, the buyer, has a lot of negotiating leverage. It's done extensive due diligence, and it's extracted 28 other specific tailored reps based on its due diligence. There is no need for a 10b-5 type representation. There's a real practical reason that my client can't live with this rep. And that's that your firm, Hogan Lovells, has an excellent litigation team. We know that.
Thank you.
If any problem comes up with the target company after the closing, your talented and creative litigators will always claim that the problem can be traced to some fact that existed before the closing and wasn't disclosed. Your litigators are going to have a field day with this rep, and I'm not comfortable with that. Let's take a look at what the statistics show. Let's start with the ABA Private Target M&A Deal Point Study, the gold standard in deal point studies. And according to this study, I win the argument 80% of the time. Keith, we were told to come up with a market deal, and you are off market. Case closed.
Now you're just being mean by calling me off market.
Yeah.
And I think you're trying to prejudice me in the extreme by calling the ABA standard the gold standard. You know better than anybody else, Rick, because you came up with this buyer power ratio study that shows that the ABA standard does not take into account the size of my client. My client is so much bigger than yours, my power ratio is greater than 500. And in that case, you'll see that I win this a lot more.
So let's step out of character very quickly. This is the new buyer power ratio study. We're working on it, and it will be released. Here, it shows that even in a deal with over a 500 buyer power ratio, still more than half the time.
I would say almost half the time we win.
Yeah, it's 57% on the don't include it side.